Hi, good morning, everyone in Calgary and midday here in central Canada. Really delighted to have you join us for this edition of City Talk. I'm Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute, and we are very fortunate to have Mayor Nenshi joining us for an hour to talk about his experience in Calgary and all the challenges that they've been meeting and what they see as being ahead. We initiate these broadcasts in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties that were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. We have these conversations in the context of those historical legacies of exclusion, and also cognizant of all the ways in which we're seeing pre-existing conditions that challenge urban environments prior to COVID are now manifesting in extraordinary ways, including the prevalence of anti-Black racism and the discrimination and exclusion that's been strengthened, I think, often by urbanist practices for BIPOC communities. So this has been an extraordinary couple of weeks here in Canada and Canadian cities and in American cities and in cities around the world. Many of you joined us earlier this week for a session, a City Talk session that Jay Pitter hosted with practitioners from across the country and across America. And subsequent to that, Jay posted a call to courage, a really serious challenge for urbanists on the CanUrb website, and you'll find it in other places. Just Google it, you'll find it. Jay Pitter Call to Courage. So we're keen to continue to have these conversations and try to find ways to do the work, the real work of city building, equitable, just, resilient cities. And joining us is Mayor Nenshi. Folks, when you're participating in these things, as you know, we videotape these and post them, and we also capture in the chat here an opportunity for you to be able to pose questions to Mayor Nenshi, but also to each other. These chat functions have turned out to be extraordinarily important, and so we capture them on the transcript and we post those too. So after this event, you'll see a recording of the mayor. You'll see a summary, sort of 5 takeaways that some of our colleagues write to sort of summarize the high points, and then you'll see the chat. And as we always tell people, this is only the beginning of a conversation. It's an ongoing work in progress. Cities are never done. And so we encourage you to have the conversation on social media, #CityTalk, and just engage in dialogue as we continue to navigate through this extraordinary period where urbanism is under siege. Municipal governments have been on the front lines of every aspect of the COVID challenge. Someone said to us yesterday on a call that it's really the first time that the visceral impacts of a global event like a pandemic have been felt expressly by municipal governments and municipal services. And so, Mayor Nenshi, we're very eager to hear what the experience has been in Calgary and how you've been addressing it. And then let's talk and hear your thoughts on what are the implications for the future. So welcome to City Talk.
Super. Thanks very much, Mary. Welcome to my bedroom here on Treaty 7 territory, a place where people have been gathering for many thousands of years. And I think it's important to remember why people have been gathering on this land. This is a semi-arid region, but people have been coming here because of the water. Because this is where 2 great rivers meet, the Bow and the Elbow River, in a place that the Blackfoot call Mokinstis. And for thousands of years, people have been gathering on this land to hunt and fish and trade, to live, to love, to dream, to dance, to fight sometimes, really to engage in all those things that mean building a community. And in times of crisis and in times of trouble, we are reminded of the importance of community building and what we can do in order to understand that even when we are physically separated, we are in fact together, and we need to be together in community in order to continue this great experiment of building. So not only have we had folks here for thousands of years, the people, the Nitsitapi, it just means people, who are the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani people. We've had the mountain people, the Stoney Nakoda, the Chiniki, the Wesley, and the Bearspaw First Nations. And we have the Beaver people, whose nation is right at the city of Calgary. We call them the Tsuut'ina people now. And of course, we've had the great history of the Métis people on this land. And for the last 150 years or so, we've tried to make a simple promise to the community. And that promise is that it doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from or how you worship or whom you love, you belong here. And you have the opportunity here to live a life of dignity and of potential. And I raise that because I think it's important for us to remember that both in our emergency response, but also in how we build community together, especially in the conversations we have right now, we have to understand the ways in which we have fulfilled that promise and that dream and the ways in which we have not. And I think that's an important place for us to begin with. You know, Calgary is one of the most diverse cities on earth. We have people from every corner of the world gathering here. And both the COVID crisis and the critical conversations we're having right now around racism, around Black Lives Matter, around Indigenous Lives Matter, are reminding us that even in a place that is so diverse, even in a place that elects a mayor that looks like me, we are still have a long way to go on our journey. And I know that we're going to spend some time talking about that today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, you know, you and I saw each other before COVID at late last year because the CUI was wanting to try to create platforms to have learning between city builders across the country. And we felt that there were incredible stories in Calgary, and that you'd already had you'd had particularly challenging circumstances. You had a flood. You've had the collapse of the oil industry. That's been even made worse during COVID. So you were already in this remarkable time of transition and reinvention, and we wanted to try to bring some focus to that. So our plans were waylaid that we couldn't come and do what we wanted to do, be there with you for a whole week, but we still will, and we are virtually. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what was happening in Calgary even before COVID hit, so people across the country have a sense of the economic challenges and some of the planning and spatial challenges that you built that spectacular library. Love that. But there are all sorts of things you've been doing. So can you just lay the groundwork so people know what it was like before COVID hit?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So we, and I'm very sad that we never did have that meeting, and I hope we can have it. It was really going to be focused. It was really going to be focused on the issues of mental health in the community, which is, you know, something that none of us are getting right in the midst of this addictions crisis. And we've heard just in the last couple of days that COVID has made the addictions crisis even worse. Yeah. But regardless of that, we are in a position where it is probably safe to say that Calgary will be hit as hard by this crisis as anywhere else in the developed world. And we're really facing a quadruple whammy, maybe a quintuple whammy, that makes it a little harder than other cities. So number one is we are facing the public health crisis, which everyone is facing. Calgary is a particular hotspot within Canada for COVID, so we're managing that. Number two is we're dealing with the fallout from the global recession, particularly its impact on storefront businesses and on retail businesses. Number three, as you mentioned, the ongoing drama and challenges in the world energy markets. And number four is, of course, in this area, we are really dependent on our travel and tourism industry. Yeah. And that industry is gone. Yeah. Gone. Yeah. And that'll take some years to recover. So ultimately, that hit has been hard for Calgary. The fifth one, of course, is the result of these critical conversations and much delayed conversations that we're having about racism and what that really means in the Canadian context, systemic racism and what that means in the Canadian context. So we're in an interesting spot. And like every city, we've been trying to manage three gauges. You've got your public health or physical health, you've got mental health, and you've got economic health. And the decisions you make on one have impacts on the other. And that's really the struggle that most communities have been going through, but that we have in particular been going through here in Calgary. So to actually answer your question, it started in a place where I think a lot of Canadians haven't really fully comprehended what happened. here in Alberta. So in Calgary, we went from having the lowest unemployment rate of any city in Canada for many, many, many years to the highest, from lowest to highest in 18 months. We went from having essentially no vacancy in the downtown core to 1 out of every 3 buildings in the downtown core is empty in, I should say 1 out of 4. We didn't quite get to 1 out of 3. 1 out of 4 buildings in the downtown core was empty in 18 months. So the dislocation has been really jarring.
Mm-hmm.
Alberta nonetheless remains the largest net contributor to the Canadian Confederation, but it has been very difficult to manage through that. And we have been on a very, very, very slow slope of recovery for some time. And then COVID crushed it. So we have no idea, frankly, how long this recovery is going to take and what kinds of decisions that we need to make going forward. So on Tuesday, Council will be deliberating the final approval of a project we've been talking about for many years called the Green Line, which will essentially double our rail-based transit in the course of the building of it, I should say, an extra 43 kilometers of line going to be built. And so that's a very big deal. It's a $4.9 billion project in the first phase. And a lot of folks are saying, look, in a post-COVID world, are people still going to work downtown? Do you still need public transit at all? Are people just going to be working from home? And it's important now that we're making big decisions, big bets on the future and what we're doing. Another thing that will surprise people is that our LRT system is the second highest ridership LRT system in North America, second only to Monterrey, Mexico.
I love your LRT. I loved it.
Our mode split into the downtown core is about 50% transit. The number of drivers has gone down, even though the overall number of people have been going up so very much. And so we've been investing in transit. We've been building the city in different ways in terms of intensifying existing neighborhoods, creating more of an exciting urban vibe in the city. And that was certainly easier when everyone wanted to live here anyway. Now it's really become continuing to attract talent, even though the economy is challenging. And here's the fascinating thing. The history of Calgary has been one of booms and busts. And very much a columnist for the Calgary Sun used to call it the U-Haul index, which is directly related to the price of oil. So the price of oil goes up and the U-Hauls come in, the price of oil goes down and the U-Hauls go out. And in this economic downturn, which has lasted nearly 6 years in Calgary now, we didn't see that. The population has continued to grow healthily every year. People are still looking for the quality of life and for the place to live. And of course, I can't speak for 5 minutes without reminding people that The Economist last year called Calgary the best city in the Western Hemisphere in which to live. 3 Canadian cities in the top 5, by the way. Calgary ranks just ahead of Vancouver, which ranks just ahead of Toronto. And that's something to be very proud of from the Canadian context. And we need to really be able to focus on that and talk about how we are going to maintain that quality of life, because ultimately now the war is for talent. And we need the best global talent to set up here in Calgary and in Canada more generally. I'm very good at very short answers to short questions, as you can tell.
It's good. No.
10 years as mayor and I still can't do a soundbite.
It's all right. The great thing about this is we don't need sound bites. We've got lots of time to really hear in detail what your thinking is. So we're appreciative of you taking the time with us. And our audience is all about trying to really get in deep on these things as best you can in an hour. When I was in New Orleans after Katrina for 5 years, and I used to describe it to me as a prophetic city, because this is in 2005, and we were hardly talking about resilience, and even climate change wasn't as broadly talked about as it is now. But I felt it was prophetic because it was a confluence of all these various challenges that had come, and infrastructure had failed, and then there was climate impacts, and then there were equity challenges, and the way that they reinvented themselves. And when I was in Calgary with you last fall, late in the early winter, I had a similar feeling around Calgary, because you, as you suggest, you're a boom bust town, which means that you've got a lot of people there that came to make something. They were attracted to something and they've made something. So you've remade yourself a number of times. And there you were kind of on the front lines of, as you suggested, the global energy markets. And I guess the collapse of a kind of monocultural economy that wasn't going to be able to sustain itself. And so I already felt that you were kind of, foreshadowing challenges that would hit others sooner. I hadn't yet. And now you've had this on top of it. So as you suggest, you had the building blocks for diversifying your economy, and then COVID hit. So talk to us a little bit about that. Has COVID in many ways confirmed the kind of directions that you were trying to focus on before it arrived economically?
Yes and no. So one of the funny things about the Calgary economy is that, when you hit a certain scale as a city, you are diverse in your economy almost by default.
Right.
And so, when I graduated from university 30 years ago,
Yes.
about 25 years ago, actually, I was a child prodigy. I was 10. The GDP of Calgary was about 50% oil and gas. And before this downturn, it was from 50% down to 30%. So we've been diversifying all over the place without anyone noticing. In fact, the GDP of the oil and gas sector, well, it's still huge, right? It's still huge. But there's all kinds of other things going on as well. And in fact, although there have been some dire pronouncements about job loss in the energy sector, we actually haven't seen a ton of it since COVID because the jobs are already gone, right? We've already lost a ton of jobs in that sector. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the loss of energy jobs in Alberta since the beginning of this downturn in 2015 is equivalent to the loss of the entire auto manufacturing sector in Canada. It's been very, very large. And one of the federal cabinet ministers from Quebec recently said to me just a few months ago, if we had lost 125,000 jobs in the Saguenay, or if we had lost 125,000 jobs in Southern Ontario, this would be a crisis of national proportions and the federal government would be thinking about nothing else. Yeah. And yet we haven't really had that national conversation in the country at all. And we've been left a bit to fend for ourselves. And we're pretty good at fending for ourselves, but there comes a point where you need a little bit of assistance. And so, in Calgary, we have this great economic development plan, Calgary and the New Economy. I get a commission every time I say Calgary and the New Economy from Calgary Economic Development. So Tick got that done. But it really focuses on some real building blocks of how you build business and then on certain industries. So it focuses on place and innovation and talent and the business environment. But it also focuses in 7 sectors where we are already quite strong, but we could be much stronger. That, of course, the first one is energy in all its forms, conventional, clean, green, renewable. There's no reason why Alberta and Calgary shouldn't be the world center for clean tech because we understand how energy works. We've got the smart people who get energy here. But then there are others, financial services, creative industries, agri-food and agribusiness. 7 billion people in the world have to eat. Life sciences, transportation and logistics, travel and tourism, the creative sector, including film. So I think I got all 7 of them and didn't repeat any. That's always my test. I scramble them to see if I can remember them all. But in any case, these are areas where we can continue to grow even in a post-COVID environment. And so a lot of folks are using the cliche, and I think the federal government has actually used it publicly, called Build Back Better. And to me, there's a lot of very deep thoughts in there. How do we build back an economy that is more resilient and more diverse? How do we build back in a way that solves many of the social issues, including homelessness and isolation of elders in our community? How do we unearth some of the real inequities that we've discovered? For example, how we treat long-term care workers in our society, as well as building a more diverse and resilient economy. So I've been saying for some time to the federal government and the provincial governments, look, there are 5 things we got to focus on as we're working on our coming out of the COVID crisis. The first is aid to vulnerable citizens and nonprofits. The second is aid to businesses. The third is aid to municipalities directly, because we have been hit by this crisis in a way that none of us expected. And for the first time in my history, almost a decade as mayor, we actually need help on our operating budget we never needed before. Mm-hmm. The fourth is building stimulative infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And the fifth is building back better, building a more resilient economy when we come back.
So can we talk a little bit about what the actual numbers are for you in Calgary? So as you said, you're a hotspot for COVID. You've have the incidences of the virus been distributed in particular kinds of ways? Are there patterns that are informing that can show you which communities are most vulnerable, have been most vulnerable?
Yes, very much so. So Calgary's been a bit of a hotspot. We have had, I should know these numbers by heart, but we have had in the 4,000s to 5,000s of cases, and we've had over 100 deaths in Calgary. 111, I think, was the last count. So it has been a bit of a hotspot, and certainly it has not been distributed equivalently across the community. Folks who, frankly, are able to work from home have, of course, been hit less. And we have had a couple of major outbreaks here. One, of course, in long-term care. We've had a few in long-term care. And we had the largest outbreak at one time in North America, which was an outbreak at a meatpacking plant, which is not in Calgary, it's in High River, Alberta. But many of the workers were from Calgary. And it really highlighted a number of things about how we make policy that are different, that need to be different. So, for example, let me just go right to it without sugarcoating the issue. Something we never talk about in our community is the fact that we have an entire class, a very large class of people who do the work Canadians don't want to do. They're Canadians, so I shouldn't say Canadians don't want to do, the work that many of us don't want to do, that we just don't think about. And so think about how we've structured the long-term care system. We basically have a large group of caregivers, most of whom are women, almost all of whom are not white, who get up very early in the morning to change our grandparents' diapers. We give them 30 hours a week at a long-term care home so we don't have to pay them benefits. So they have to cobble together another job, another 30 hours a week, the morning shift in one place, the evening shift in another, to get to 60 hours a week, still no benefits, to be able to have at least a passable or decent quality of life. Mm-hmm. And we need a promise to folks when they come to this country that this is a place of boundless opportunity and potential. And for too many first-generation Canadians and immigrants and refugees, we don't fulfill that promise. And we've created this class of people that do work that is absolutely required, but that we don't value. And so in the case of the outbreaks in Calgary, we know that a lot of these women in particular who are working in the long-term care centers have husbands who are working in manual labor, who may well have husbands who work at meatpacking plants. And this entire thing, and there are men who work as caregivers and women who work in the meatpacking plants, but you see the point that I'm making. They live in multi-generational homes with their grandparents. They often work in places where public transit is not great, so they carpool. Yeah. And so all of this tells us that our theoretically value neutral arguments about public health and how a virus like this is the great leveler are actually very incorrect. And so it is true that Northeast Calgary, where I live, which is very ethnically diverse, has seen higher cases than the other parts of the city, but it actually has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with economy, and a little bit to do as well with just how people live differently. In my neighborhood, multi-generational families are the norm, with at least 3 generations living under the same roof. And when one person has COVID, we got to figure out how to isolate the rest of the family. And these things have been extremely challenging.
Well, yes, and it's made so clear the failure of urban planning around the kind of density that's been created that lower income folks have access to. As you say, it's overcrowding. There aren't great public amenities around it. And
Well, don't go too far, Mary, because it's not just lower income people, and I think that's the critical piece here. I
yes,
happen to live in a neighborhood with very nice big houses and a lake in the middle of it, but because the houses are big, they are accommodating for bigger families.
that's the point.
And
Yeah.
so these are not necessarily low income people, but they are people who choose to live in a multi generational household. And we just are not really there for that.
Yeah, and I guess it's a challenge, isn't it? Let's hope that the design community and the planning community start to embrace this and figure this out. Because as you suggest quite rightly, and thank you for correcting me, I know that to be true in certain neighborhoods, certainly, and they can be culturally organized neighborhoods. But as you suggest, where large family homes have increasingly been used as multifamily homes and
Yeah.
multi-generational homes. Yeah.
Yeah. And remember, too, that one thing we don't really know yet, just because of the fact that this COVID outbreak hit us in the late winter and the spring, is we don't have a great sense of what happens in multifamily residential homes, even if they're super high-end condos, in terms of the air circulation and the air systems.
Yes.
We think that COVID is not a particularly airborne illness, but these are other things we've got to think about as well.
Yeah, well, yes, and we've heard all those stories about kids doing homework in hallways with no lighting, and I mean, as you say, as you're describing it. So, in terms of how the municipal government has responded, you've had to do layoffs, I think, right? To my knowledge, did you have to lay off permanent staff, or did you just lay off contract staff, or how did you determine how to cope with that?
So we've had to lay off about 15% of city staff, about 1,800 people, which has been very hard. Yeah. Certainly not something that we ever wanted to do. We started by laying off on-call and temporary folks. We didn't hire seasonal folks. We tried to be very clear about if you don't have work, then they're the folks we lay off. And we closed all our rec systems. We cut our transit system by a third, and so on. So these are been very, very tough decisions. Now, as of today, gyms and rec centers are able to reopen. And so some folks are calling me saying, are the city pools and the city rec center is going to be open today? And the answer is no, they're not going to be open for a while yet.
Right.
Because I can't just hire people on a dime. I've got to go back. I've got to bring people back. I've got to sanitize the facilities. I've got to understand and abide by the guidelines, the new guidelines that mean running a gym is going to be very different. And so all of these things are critical, but there were decisions that had to be made. And I'm sure you're going to go to the question next, Mary, so I'll just tell you that this has had a huge financial impact on the city. So we are bleeding money, probably $10 to $15 million a week. And so by the end of this year, we are looking at a deficit in the city of Calgary, in the first case, from 130 to $250 million roughly. But that assumes that businesses don't go out of business. It assumes a standard default rate on our property taxes. Our taxes are normally due at the end of June, and we have deferred those until the end of August, the end of September, without interest or penalty. We still want people to pay in June. But we've deferred until the end of September for those who, just to take that pressure off of people, one less thing to worry about. But that also means that there may well be some businesses that were here in June that won't be here in September. And I hope that's not true. I hope that number is zero. But if those defaults come into place, then we could be looking at a deficit at the end of the year of $400 million. And, cities across Canada cannot easily run deficits.
No.
The rules are a bit confusing for Calgary under our new city charter, but I just like to make it simple and say we can't run deficits. In reality, we can't budget for deficits. And if we end up running one, then we've got to pay it back.
Right.
But of course, cities only have property taxes and user fees to rely on. So to pay back that deficit in 1 or 2 years means either a massive increase in property taxes, or a massive increase in user fees, or a massive cut in services. And we're a city where about 75% of our budget goes to police, fire, 911, roads, and transit.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult for us to imagine that a big increase in tax or a big cut to services is the right thing to do as we're going through a recovery from a pandemic like this.
Do you have a sense of whether the business community understands this? I mean, we're hearing this across the country. We had Mayor Tory here on City Talk earlier this week, and you know, all the essential services that you just laid out are the preconditions for anyone to operate a business or be able to live their lives in a healthy way. And I think we're not, you know, lots of people that live in Canada don't really realize which level of government pays for what. You know,
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. So do you have a sense of whether the business community, as it starts to plan its recovery, as you suggest, is aware that if there isn't some kind of different kind of mechanism to get money into municipal governments, that's going to compromise their ability to actually recover?
Yes and no. The business lobby groups, I have to say, have not done the business community any favors, because when we talk about the need for fundamental tax reform,
Yeah.
they by and large jump up and down and say, no new taxes.
Yeah.
But, and you know, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce has not done that, to be fair, right? They've really said we have to have a conversation about real tax reform. But the problem here is that the property tax is grotesquely unfair. It's a terrible way of raising revenue. It's unfair to people on fixed incomes who happen to have lived in their house for a long time in a neighborhood that certainly became trendy.
Yeah.
Or suddenly became trendy. And it's particularly unfair for businesses, for small businesses, because I'm taxing you on your landlord's wealth, not on how well your business did this year.
Right.
And that's a ridiculous situation.
And actually,
so,
on your landlord's unrealized wealth, because it's just equity on paper. That landlord,
that's right.
it could be a family that owns that building on a main street, for instance, but they haven't realized any of that profit.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And so it's a terrible way of doing this work. And so the real conversation is about fundamental tax reform. The real conversation is about a new fiscal federalism. And maybe if we're lucky, COVID will help us have that conversation. But, you know, ultimately, we've had a big problem with business taxes in Calgary. We've actually did a shift where we shifted some of them tax funding this year from non-residential to residential, resulting, even though we kept our budget flat, resulting in an average $20 a month increase to people's homes, which hit right in the middle of COVID. So terrible timing, but it did mean that businesses got about a 12% cut in their taxes because of this whole shift issue that we've had. The shift issue is because the assessment of the downtown core has gone down. So businesses outside of the downtown have seen their taxes go way up since everyone pays the same rate. But, you know, in that whole conversation with businesses and that critical conversation with how we can assist businesses, what I really learned was there's very little understanding of the services the city provides and why those are important for businesses to be able to succeed.
Mm-hmm. So have you done some thinking about what the alternatives are? We're running this Bring Back Main Street project across the country on exactly what we're concerned about that you have echoed, that if you don't find ways to support your local businesses and the other tenants on that main street, which may be a faith institution or could be a library or a community center, could be a not-for-profit office, it could be a curling club for all we, you know, but all these different things that make a neighborhood safe and vibrant. Have you thought at all about what the reform might look like? For instance, do we need to start, as you suggest, a new fiscal federalism? Does this mean somehow not levying property tax on street level business retail?
I would love to think about any way in which we can be less reliant on property taxes, especially non-residential property taxes. Of course, here in Canada, we don't have the ability to levy consumption taxes. We don't have one in Alberta anyway. We don't have the ability to levy income taxes or anything like that.
Do you want
that?
Would you like that?
Well, you know, I think it would make a ton of sense. I think that it would make a ton of sense. And I'm willing to make a deal saying, look, for any dollar that we get in a new form of taxation, we'll reduce property taxes by the same amount. I'm happy to be revenue neutral. The challenge here is a bit deeper, which is that property taxes are extremely stable. So here in Alberta, the provincial government also levies property taxes. And they like them because they're stable. But their stability is why they're unfair.
Right.
And so this is always a balance. You don't want to end up in a situation like provincial governments where, especially in Alberta, where revenues go so up and down every year with the economy. But I think large cities in particular are in a position where we can be a little more exposed to that volatility in order to achieve more fairness. There's lots of interesting things. Like I've got a big travel and tourism economy here. A lot of visitors come to Calgary, and I don't get a penny out of them.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you count the property tax I get on the restaurants and hotels that are open because of them. But I don't have a hotel tax. I don't have a sales tax, right? I don't have any ability to be able to achieve any money. Now, Calgary is also a bit of a unicity. More than 85% or 90% of the regional population lives within Calgary. But for other cities, you have a lot of folks who don't live in the city, but come into the city for work, use public transit, bring their kids in for soccer at the city-owned rec facilities, and the city has no way of capturing revenue from them either.
Yeah. So do you now have the authority where you could actually enact a hotel tax, or do you need the permission of the province to do that?
We do not have that authority. It was part of our city charter conversations. It was removed at the last moment for further consultation.
Yes.
And now we're in a point where that particular industry is not one you're going to levy any taxes on. They need a lot of help. It's the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, this is the dilemma. As you say, the property tax is a stable source of revenue, but not during a pandemic. It isn't, when you're actually giving a break to all your businesses to say that they don't need to pay it, right?
Yeah, and well, they do have to pay it. They just have to pay it
Eventually.
on time.
Right.
And all I've been able to offer is a deferral,
right?
Which certainly helps with cash flow, but it's not a real great solution. But I simply do not have the fiscal capacity to forgive people's taxes because remember, we budget for a balance every year, and so I just don't have the ability to do that, and I think that has been challenging.
So do you have a sense, I know that you're active in the Big City Mayor's Caucus that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities convenes, and I know that they have a significant case that they've made to the federal government for support. Do you have a sense of the way forward in terms of closing that gap and then going forward? Because as you know, in your out years, it's going to continue. These businesses are not likely to recover quickly. Have you got what the process is and
the cities have never asked for operational funding assistance before. We've managed our operating budgets on our own. We rely on the other orders of government or the taxes that people in cities pay to the other orders of government for our capital funding for building stuff. Ultimately, number one is we are going to need a backstop on transit revenues right away. So the federal and provincial governments are going to have to come to a deal for the larger cities that have a great reliance on our fare box to run our transit system. Yeah. In Calgary, our ridership is down 90%, but I've still got 100,000 boardings a day. And those people aren't boarding just because they enjoy taking the train. They're boarding because they got to go to work.
And you were saying, and 50% of the workforce is coming in anyway. You were saying 50% of the trips are coming into under normal circumstances. So you had a lot of people using transit.
Yeah. And so, but now I've still got 100,000 people coming in, but I'm not making any money. Right. And in fact, we're boarding the bus, although we're still collecting fares, we're boarding the buses from the back of the bus. It's an honor system. Yeah. In fact, our fare evasion is very low, though. Most people are still paying. But all of that said, so we're going to need, and I'm trying to get a little more solutions focused here, but we are going to need a backstop from the federal government on transit in particular, as well as generally on revenues to manage the issue around deficits by the end of the year. That's got to come relatively quickly because cities are going into budgeting and they need to know if they've got to make up these deficits next year and make tough decisions that way. Number two is, as you say, a change and a shift in fiscal federalism, which is really talking about how we share revenues in different ways. Some years ago when the GST was brought down from 7 to 5, there was an argument saying keep it at 7 and send that 2% directly to municipalities. In some provinces, they do share their sales tax directly. We have a new revenue sharing scheme under our city charter with the government of Alberta, but it only gets us back to 2019 levels of funding in 2040 something. Right. So these are very large challenges that we face, but it requires an open mind about thinking about tax reform fundamentally and what new kinds of taxes might be.
I mean, there may be, though, a willingness to consider something now under the COVID crisis than that had previously not been. There are less fundamental examples of this. Mayor Tory said on Tuesday, what would have taken 5 years to get bike lanes approved, he got approved in 3 weeks. So do you think that there's an opportunity here? And tell us about the disposition of your provincial government. They haven't, prior to COVID, been particularly pro-urban, I guess, but do you think under these circumstances they might be more likely to consider some of these tools?
Well, they are very poor, or so they keep telling me.
Right.
Although they have the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any provincial government, they keep telling me that they just don't have any money. But they have shifted a little bit. We had a Minister of Finance who last year said economic diversification is a luxury we can't afford in bad times, who just last week unveiled a new economic diversification plan. So they have woken up to this a little bit, but the problem is the eternal problem of Canadian federalism. I'm sorry that we spent 40 minutes talking about the problems, but that it's just endless past the hat.
Right.
The federal government says that, it's a provincial responsibility, and the provinces say, we're poor, you have all the money, figure it out. And in the end, it's the citizens who end up hurting. And so we really need the feds and the provinces to come to the table together. And, kudos to Premier Ford in Ontario. He's really been the one who said, I'm going to be at the table and we'll work this out together. Most of the other provinces and the federal government have essentially said to one another, your problem, I'm not dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, as you suggest, it's not only past the hat, but from a resident's point of view, it's past the buck. We can never seem to find anybody that will assume full responsibility for an area that is failing. So why don't we have enough housing? Why don't we have business incentives? So I think.
Well, even when it's about priorities, though, right? Even when it's one order of government's clear responsibility. So the example I've been giving is, look, we found in 20 minutes $9 billion for students who are having trouble getting summer jobs. Totally worth it. Totally worthy. $9 billion, got it in 20 minutes.
Right.
How many decades have we had boil water advisories on First Nations reserves that would take $3 billion to fix? And the federal government has never been able to find $3 billion for that. Priorities.
It's shocking, isn't it? I mean, it's brought into sort of a shocking picture, as you suggested. Let's shift for the last few minutes, if we can, to some tangible things that you can do within your own jurisdiction and in your authority. And you've been doing some of it. So let's talk. And we've been wondering, things that are introduced temporarily during COVID as a coping mechanism, maybe they'll stick, So talk to us about the land use decisions you've made, because I know you've had quiet streets. You've been providing access to outdoor space. Any thinking on how that's going to continue, or what your lessons have been through that?
Yeah, we're watching it very carefully. So like many places, we opened up streets temporarily to reduce congestion for bike lanes and pathways and so on. We have, what's the number? Not quite 100, I believe, kilometers of lanes open now. For that, some of that will be permanent, some of it won't. Some of it was just easy to do because traffic had gone down so much. And as traffic is going up, you want to be careful about congestion as well. So these are things to balance off. But I want to tell you about one thing that I'm dreaming about, and that is homelessness.
Okay.
And so when we looked at opening these overflow shelters, I think a lot of citizens were shocked when they saw pictures of wrestling mats on the floor in a church, 1 meter apart, not realizing that's the lived reality for 4,000 Calgarians a night on any given night.
Yeah.
And so I've been asking a lot of folks to dream about the following question. What if at the end of the pandemic, nobody goes back to emergency shelter? What if we use the fact that we've got vacancy rate and the fact that we've got the ability to do things for less than the cost of a shelter system, to say, let's make Calgary the first large city in North America to actually take housing first seriously and end functional homelessness through the use of rent supplements, affordable housing, permanent supportive housing for some folks, and addictions treatment for some folks. And really say that no one should have to sleep on a mat on the floor for more than a couple of nights until we find them a better place to go.
Mhm.
That's a big shift. Housing first is not a shift in our thinking. We've been talking about it for 15 years, but actually putting money against it and saying this is our goal is a shift in our thinking. So can we do that? So I've been thinking a lot about these kinds of moonshots, right? What do we do to build back better, and how do we manage coming back in a much smarter way, not just about land use, but about homelessness, about economic development and resilience, and supporting small business, all sorts of things. And I really want to make sure we get to talk to the big social movement that's going on right now. Somebody gave me a really interesting thought exercise, which is right now when you phone 911, the people answer the phone with Calgary 911, police, fire, or ambulance. But given the kind of calls they get at Calgary 911, what if they answered the phone with police, fire, ambulance, or mental health?
Mhm.
And we dispatch the kind of help that people need at that moment. So I think there are some really interesting opportunities here for us to think big and use the fact that people have been so resilient that our lives literally changed over a weekend. It was that fast. March 15th, that weekend, right? Everything changed and we were able to cope and we were able to shift. So can we take the fact that we were that resilient and apply that to some of the very, very big concerns we have in our community?
Mhm. I mean, that would be certainly, that's not only a symbolic gesture, but that would be also a structural gesture, because it would mean that there would need to be referral services tied into 911, which would ultimately affect the delivery of fire and police and ambulance as well. And of course, we're getting those calls around the world for defunding the police, which is all about reallocating resources in ways that speak more to the challenge that the support that people need. Hmm. And any other thoughts like that? Any other moonshots that are in your brain there, Mayor Nenshi?
Yeah, I have so many of them. One of them is, well, I'll come back to that one actually, because we can spend some time on it. There's a very specific one for Calgary that is around sport and making sure that we own the podium. I was very sad that we didn't get the chance to bid on the 2026 Olympics, but it also means that we have to make a pretty big investment in our high performance sport facilities. It's another big one. Housing, as I've talked about. Transit. This is a bet. This one's a bet. Transit is way, way, way down in ridership. But
Mhm.
can we say that this really is an opportunity for us to do a great focus on public transit and building out a lot of those transit projects that have been on the books for a long time, in a time when interest rates are close to zero,
Yeah.
where jobs are needed, and where we have the ability to build infrastructure that is desperately required? And can we get resilience and build that way? But then,
Are
of
you
course, right now, go ahead.
are you confident that people will go back to transit? They'll have to, I guess. Right?
Eventually, this is a problem of geometry.
Yes.
If we believe that people are still going to not work from home 100% of the time and they need to get out of the house, the roads just aren't big enough to handle all that capacity, even in a world of autonomous vehicles.
Mhm.
So ultimately, it's a question of geometry. One Calgary Transit C train car holds as many people as 100 private vehicles.
Right.
And so ultimately, yeah, people will go back. My crystal ball is very foggy in terms of what work from home is going to look like in the future. But I believe people are social. People want to go back to things the way they were. They want to be more productive. And so I suspect that some employers will be a lot more flexible in being able to work from home a day or two a week and so on. But ultimately, we will see some semblance of people returning to offices, and transit will be required.
Do you think that we can come out of this with a redoubling or a recommitment to the public realm generally? How we invest in our streets, parks, all that kind of thing? Should we?
It's a super interesting question because we've also been very, very private
Yeah.
in our lives in the last little while. And in a weird and ironic way, having lived very private lives is also leading us to value the public realm in a different way.
Yeah.
Parks are so much more important than they ever were before. the ability to see other people is so much more important. So certainly I'm thinking hard. And I think we've done a pretty good job on it to date. But I am thinking hard about, okay, what does the world look like in terms of the public services and the public realm that we're providing forward?
You know, we have a history in North America of these monumental public works projects, like the Workers' Progress Administration that created all the national parks infrastructure and all sorts of spectacular things that we saw happen in America. And do you think will we see that kind of a moment? As you say, we're going to build back better. Can we commit to large infrastructure projects that will be green and resilient and have equity right at the center of it? Is there a pivot here?
You know, I think so, and I think that we need to think about the world in a new way in terms of how people are living together. I don't know if it's a pivot so much as a refocus on other kinds of priorities, which I think are really important.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but what I want to get to the other big conversation, I don't want to lose it in this context, but that big conversation really is, has something fundamentally changed in the last month about how we think about how we live together in community, and how we think about Black Lives Matter, and how we think about Indigenous Lives Matter? So I have been talking a lot about what does it mean to go from being inclusive and diverse and multicultural and being not racist to being actively anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that conversation has shifted in a very fundamental way. I liken it to being in the mountains in the springtime and you hear a big crack. And the crack is the ice that had previously been quietly melting, mm-hmm. breaking open, mm-hmm. and the water starting to flow. And I would like to believe that we are in that world right now, and that it really is a huge opportunity for us to talk about how we ensure that everyone who lives in our community, particularly Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians, other people of color, have the opportunity to live a life of their full potential. And I think it's time for us to have bigger and broader and better conversations about this, about what systemic racism really means in the Canadian context. So last week I spent a lot of time with high school students, mm-hmm. and in particular with students who went to Western Canada High School, which is one of the best public schools in the country, in the heart of downtown Calgary. So you've got students who go to school in the downtown core of one of the most diverse cities on earth. And they're getting an outstanding public education, and they have a life of limitless potential ahead of them. And yet, the conversations they were having about the pathways that they are on and the life they live for themselves was so different based on the color of their skin. And this is a critical thing. You know, one thing that I've been saying that shocks literally no one of color, but I've seen so many shocked faces for, is the story that I was having with these students. So I asked them, how many of you have your driver's license? We keep hearing that these Gen Z folks never have a driver's license, right? But a lot of them did. And so they put up their hand, the ones that did put up their hand, and I said, okay, so let me tell you what your parents said when you got your driver's license. Because you all got the same lecture. You got the same lecture that I got when I turned, well, I didn't get mine until after I was 16, but when I got mine. And that is, don't speed, drive safely, don't have too many friends in the car, don't have the music too loud, don't text and drive, put your phone in the back seat, don't drink and drive, stay focused, and for the love of God, don't scratch my car. So we all get that lecture, and those who are parents have given that lecture. Every single person of color gets part 2 of that lecture when they get their driver's license. And that is, don't resist. Never have your wallet in your pocket. Have your wallet on the seat so you can reach for it easily. If you get pulled over, put your hands in the air where they can see them. If you have to reach for something, reach with your left hand, keep your right hand in the air. If they ask you to get out of the car, get out of the car. If they ask you to get on the ground, get on the ground. Don't resist, no matter how unjust it is. It's not worth it. And even in a place like Calgary, where the Calgary Police Service has been on a tremendous journey of allyship, has been on a journey to figure out how they understand their job is to protect the safety of marginalized communities. Even in a place like Calgary, kids get that lecture. And so it's important that we're in a place now where we actually understand that the lived experience of Canadians in this marvelous place is different based on the color of your skin. And for 10 years, I have been saying, you know, I grew up in a Calgary where I never once thought there was a single job I couldn't do because of my faith or because of the color of my skin, except maybe rabbi. But while that is mostly true, it is not, in fact, the lived experience for everyone, and it's particularly not the lived experience for many Black Canadians and many Indigenous Canadians. And so it really is time for us to think about what it means to shift our power structures. You know, I had a very interesting situation myself last week where a very, very prominent Calgarian who is on the news, on TV, on the radio all the time, said a particularly nastily racist thing, not just about me, but about much of Calgary, basically implying that the only reason I'm mayor is because all the ethnic people voted for me. And the challenge with that, there are many challenges with it. One, it's factually untrue. I won 12 out of 14 wards in the city. Number two, and there aren't enough ethnic people to make that difference. Still only 1 in 3 Calgarians. Number two, it implies that people who are not white were only voting for me because I'm not white. Number three, it implies that people who are not white somehow don't have the right to vote, or perhaps their vote should count for less. So it was a deeply offensive thing packaged up in a deeply offensive way, and he got in a lot of trouble for it. But he got in a lot of trouble for it because his timing was bad, because it happened to happen in this week. Because he's been saying nasty, horrific things worse than that about me for years. He's been saying nasty, horrific things about the Prime Minister for years. He once called for people who disagree with him, environmentalists, to be publicly hung in the streets. And yet, we have him on TV, we have him on the radio, we talk to him as though he's an expert in areas he doesn't know anything about. And so I ask, you know, I used to be a columnist for the Calgary Herald, and I asked if I had put up a tweet when I was a columnist that said, all fat cat oil people should be hung in the streets for their crimes against climate. It's pretty clear that I wouldn't be a columnist for the Herald anymore. And this has been going on for 3 years with this guy. So ask yourself, what does that mean? What does that word privilege mean? What does that word platform mean? And how do we think about things incredibly differently as we move forward? How do we go from being not racist to being anti-racist? I don't know the answers to these questions. I don't even know where to begin. I know that we have to start by listening and learning. I think that's critical. I have not been at the protests, even though I really want to go. Even though I've been inside the system for so long, I have helped organize and marched in more peaceful protests and marches than I can count. And I haven't gone for 2 reasons. Number one is, well, we're still in a public health pandemic. I've got a 79-year-old mother that lives with me in my multi-generational home, and I just can't risk bringing home the virus to her. But number two is I also think I don't want to take the oxygen. I don't want the story to be mayor showed up at the protest. And I'm not condemning the Prime Minister or Senator Romney or whoever who did it. Those are choices they make. But I want to listen to the voices, to the real, authentic, lived voices that we hear in the community. But I want to remind everybody of something. It is time for listening and it is time for learning. But here's the thing. Listening and learning is not the work. Listening and learning is the prerequisite to the work. And sometime very soon, we got to get to the work. And we've got to figure out what that work is. And it's hard. And I do not know what the answers are. But ultimately, it is our job to figure out those answers, to make sure everyone in our community is living a life to their full potential, a life of dignity in this community. I said at the very beginning that we have a promise on this land. And that promise is that it doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from or how you worship or whom you love. What matters is that you're here. What matters is that you belong here and that you have the right. You have the right here, right now, to live a great Canadian life. And ultimately, that is what we have to figure out, how to make that true, how to live that promise, how to fulfill that promise for every single Canadian.
And that, folks, is the Mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi. You know, I think the wonderful thing about this extraordinary time is that we're getting a chance to hear one another, and that the platform exists for us to hear one another. And we appreciate, as you suggest, it's not the work, it's the prerequisite for the work, that we listen and learn. And so we have so many people on the chat and across the country that are engaged in building cities and can actually, once we're ready to act, we can make the built environment better, and we can build back better in ways that are more just and more resilient. So thank you, Mayor Nenshi, for all of us.
Thank you. We didn't get to hardly any of the technical questions on the chat. I am very comfortable with building that bridge over Princess Island, and I don't think it's going to ruin the island. I think it'll actually make it a little bit better. That's a whole other story. But sometime, Mary, we should have a super wonky version of this, where we just answer, you know, really specific questions about repurposing land and land use and the future of how people live in the community.
You know, I think that I agree with you. We need to move to the brass tacks, and we will soon. A week from today, folks, is 100 days of COVID. COVID100.ca. Go and look at that, and you'll see that for the day we're doing a cross-Canada survey, 6 sessions, Halifax, Montreal, London, Winnipeg, Calgary, and Vancouver, Victoria, to hear what's going on the ground. We'll be back in Calgary with some of your colleagues, Mayor Nenshi. And at the end of that, we're going to have a sense of what are the signposts that we have to pay attention to for the first 100 days to bring back whatever urban Canada is going to look like. So as you quite rightly pointed out, Mayor Nenshi, there are going to be further wonky technical sessions about how we concretely start to pull ourselves back into a better place. So on that very hopeful note, Mayor Nenshi, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.